Yeah, I guess this is me.
Right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to my session, Transforming Princeton University Art Museum's Digital Presence. I'm Sean Walsh, the website manager for Princeton University Art Museum. I gave this talk a little while ago at Drupal Camp, New Jersey, so it's much a riff on that talk, a little bit different. Hopefully, you'll gain some insights into, building long-lasting projects, and kind of these weird inflection points of like massive transformation as we go through the talk. Feel free to drop questions in the chat, and we'll have time at the end to kind of go through things. All right. So, real quick agenda. This is kind of a case study, but also kind of a story of like maintaining like very long-lasting digital applications. So specifically, this is about our transition from a 12-year-old Drupal 7 site to a Drupal 11 site. We're going to talk about content components, designing with components along the way. We'll talk about integrating React into specifically a Drupal application in this case. And we'll talk about collaborating with outside parties and different people on different teams to kind of make a really great product at the end of the day. So just for like real brief history, the Princeton University Art Museum, um, sometime in the early 20 teens, had set out to kind of redo their entire web presence. They were on some XML-based system called Roxen that Princeton University was using those days. Um, They were one of the first sites, one of two, to launch on Drupal, and eventually the university. And I'm sure many of you coming from universities are on Drupal or PHP platforms, WordPress, and Backdrop. So, kind of probably a familiar story, guiding off some odd thing that one guy in Alaska maintained. In this case, to something a little bit more community driven, a little bit bigger. You can see here this like 960 grid uh, website, not too unfamiliar probably for those who have been around long enough, and it had some colors and things like that going on. It really was kind of a heavy lift, and I got brought into it as a contractor towards the end of that cycle, right before launch. So trying to get it kind of over the finish line on some like remaining features and bug fixing and things like that. And basically, the prior vendor had done the design work. They'd done data integrations by bolting on a secondary database table, which was updated with art information versus embedding a different system or linking off to a different website. So everything was kind of integrated, not without its challenges. It launched. It didn't scale well. It was on internal infrastructure, couldn't handle pressure, especially like image management and things like that. And so eventually we moved to cloud hosting. Things got a lot better, caching got a lot better, all the things. And that site kind of chugged along and did its job. Then around 2015, responsive web design kind of hits. We undergo this, massive redesign project, leaving the kind of underpinnings very much the same. Really design refresh, some content architecture refreshes, introduction of you know paragraphs instead of using panels in Drupal speak, um, and making it work across a whole bunch of devices instead of only if you had a 960 pixel wide device or wider, as the old one was. And eventually, the site kind of morphed a little bit more. The data became API driven instead of secondary database driven. There was a React search application added. A whole bunch of things happened to it. So, like, it stood the test of time, right? And then around 2023, set out to start work on a new website and other digital experiences, because a new building was being built on the foundation or location of where the old building was. So it's a completely massive project to build a new building and also a new digital presence. So there's a brand new uh, brand brand design, which was again crafted for more traditional media, right? It wasn't necessarily thought digital first. And so the art museum underwent a search, as they do, landed on two kind of competing visions for what the future would hold. One of those visions was WordPress and a whole bunch of third-party things. And another vision was upgrading to modern Drupal, which is ultimately the route that it went. Again, staff familiarity with Drupal, I think was helpful. And I think just overall our knowledge that we wanted it to be well structured and pluggable and things like that kind of lended towards that decision. Not to mention that our partner, Blue Cadet, also was kind of able to deliver additional digital experiences such as video and some other things that we were working on for our launch. So real quick project challenges. I'll get into each one of these a little bit, but like we had all these years of content that we had to untangle. We had to implement a new brand. We had to keep systems in sync. We had to enable better discovery and research. And we had to standardize media delivery because it was kind of all over the place. One thing I forgot to mention was all this art is currently on view at the museum today. So I'm just kind of using it more for illustrative purposes and some just because I like it. But this one you can see, nice dragon getting slayed, as an old website happens to be. So talking about untangling years of content, right? We had this Drupal 7 site. We had generations of content, right? So we had pre and post paragraphs content, different versions of, modules and so many things under the hood. Pre-media, like file system stuff at one point, right? So like it really like morphed and evolved over time, and that made it messy. And as I said, it was like we had moved most of it away from this bolted on table for art data, but not 100%. So there was still some cleanup to do there. And our API was kind of driving most of the art, but again, not all of it. And we had to kind of see what that meant. We also had a secondary CMS, which was tacked on to store some collections adjacent information that wasn't necessarily to go online. Some of it did, some of it didn't. But ultimately, you had two different teams working two different systems. So there was some duplication there. Formatting was different. Strappy used a completely different editor experience, so the options were different, like a WYSIWYG editor. It was MongoDB backend, so also a different database backend. So lots of interesting things there to kind of pull data out of that system and unify it. And we also had multimedia kind of across the internet. So primarily video was in a thing called Media Central, which was backed by Kaltura. We also had stored some stuff in archive.org at one point and SoundCloud. So again, like lots of content, lots of places, lots of kind of auditing that needed to be done. And so, we had to extract all that data, largely pulling things into spreadsheets to kind of compare and contrast the state of any particular piece of content, whether or not it had media, whether or not it had relationships, whether or not it had paragraphs, all this kind of stuff. We had to, make some big decisions on what to keep, what to slough off. We had to clean it because, of course, formatting from various systems to other systems, you end up with weird characters and all this other fun stuff. And then we had to import it and kind of get it nice and clean and do a whole bunch of things. So there was a lot to do in terms of not only auditing, but just kind of getting it over the finish line. At the same time that we were undertaking that project, we were also thinking through with our partner, how do we implement this new brand for the digital space? We had a new identity and logo, new typography, color palette, voice and tone, lots of things to consider there to come up with a new design. And like as you see, like, hey, look, that's not the black and white website that we had and rebuilt in the responsive design days, right? And so um, I think trends come and go, right? So like one of the trends was we got a little bit more colorful. Um, as I mentioned, uh, this primarily was a component-driven design project, right? So like really heavily leveraged single directory components because we were moving to modern Drupal. Um, so we leveraging reusable blocks that would be able to kind of live in isolation and then bubble up into the site, all aligned with our new brand. So again, using CSS variables and things like that that we could pass down those core pieces of our design to these components. And we end up with like over 70 single directory components. So that's a lot of things. As you can see here on the side, we have a card component, which is kind of like standard card. We have different variants of it, condensed, featured, group, all these other kinds of things. And we also have a variety of heroes, right? So different types of hero layouts and configurations. And just for illustration purposes, just to kind of talk through one of these. So if we look at this home hero here, we have a CSS file. That's the kind of built CSS file from our post CSS, which is the PCSS one. We have a little bit of JavaScript to do some of the interactions there. We have our twig template file storing our markup and some logic. And then we have our component .yaml file. And so the component.yaml file defines the schema for that component. So it's kind of like the API of that component, what it expects, types of data, how it's formatted, what we can pass into it, and some metadata about it. Now I'm going to switch over to just kind of show you the website. So here's our website. Here's one of our hero components, which has multiple images and text in the video. But just to kind of illustrate like the variety of cards and how they flex. So these are featured cards here. They all tend to have an image plus some amount of text, some more or less. And then down here we have kind of like content cards, cards all the way down. We got lots of cards. It's a very card-driven design. And they all kind of flex and do their thing. Like an event card has a date, right? And then we have this billboard, which is kind of a card. And then kind of bouncing over to our visit page, we have this other component called an hours card. So again, what our contract in that component.yaml file is like what data we're having for any one of these given card components, but they all kind of inherit the same kind of structure, right? And just the kind of like details are slightly different, right? Like what's going inside this slot of information. Yeah, lots and lots of cards and lots of variety of those across the website. So switching back. So the benefits of single directory components, and you can see here the hours card kind of component structure. So all our code is co-located. So if we want to work on the hours card, we can just go to that one folder. Pretty much everything we need is there, except for some of those global things like colors and typography that we're passing through variables. They're easy to extend and iterate. So we've already made publication cards and other random things that we hadn't anticipated or didn't get around to for our launch last August. So again, easy to take component, iterate on it, change it around because it has slightly different content needs and things like that. And the future readiness of single directory components, I think, was a strong reason to go with it. That's kind of where we're headed with the Drupal canvas and things like that, which I think sets us up for the most part in a good way. Although again, we're still probably majority paragraphs, but all those paragraphs are single directory components under the hood. So there's some work ongoing in the Drupal community to kind of get paragraphs to be first-class citizens in Drupal canvas. But I think we're well positioned to kind of reuse these things because of the way it's built. So switching gears to kind of talk about keeping systems in sync. We have a lot of information to share with the world about our collections. And as I mentioned in our earlier iteration, we either bolted it on or we ended up doing APIs. And ultimately, what we really want to do is like mirror this information, artworks and their metadata, exhibitions. And we had existing APIs, but they kind of had different use cases. We needed some internal data to be shared that didn't really matter to like a public API. It was more so for the website and things like that. And so we ended up building out a whole bunch of new API endpoints that are more private and protected that we can use to kind of build out the website. But we are syncing that data in, again, for cacheability and things like that. And, you know, being able to look it up and do different interesting things with it within the CMS. So the approach that we took, and it took us a little bit to kind of land happily through this, was to use queue workers plus these new APIs. So like I said, we developed all these new API endpoints. We use cron to build the queues, and the queue gets processed from there. You know, some growing pains. How do we get all of the data in like the first time? Like, so we had an initial migration just to kind of stub everything out. And then we use the queues to kind of feed all that data. And sometimes it would take a really long time, and then we'd have to look back and we'd have to iterate on what that meant. What could we do to improve it, right? So there was a lot of like iterative process to get the data happily into the CMS database. And I will say, like, along the way, we kind of realized that the queues were ballooning and we didn't know why. And we were like, why are there so many rows in this table? And we ended up leveraging something called queue unique, which allows which ensures that the rows inside that queue table are unique, right? So that we're not reprocessing the same data over and over and over again. So that was a lesson learned. And a friend of mine, Peter Willanen, who organizes Drupal Camp New Jersey with me, had mentioned to me that there was also some like secret way of like double underscoring your queue worker names that would magically make them unique or something like that without us having to define it in config and things like that. So there's interesting things that we could probably improve still on this. And there's new data that we've done since launch, right? So now we're, I don't know, 8 months or more post-launch. And you know, we're still adding new data. We're still tweaking some things here and there, but for the most part, it's running happily along. Of course, when we have a big data push, we kind of need to ponder a little bit more aggressively than we do on day-to-day basis when we have some, you know, number of things coming through, but you know, that's kind of par for the course. Here, I'm just going to pop over to an object page just to kind of see. So again, where data is coming through, we're getting like image data and a whole bunch of like functionality for like zooming in, like a different viewer that we provide, downloading those images, providing information, you know, for citations and things like that. Also have this ability to heart, which is using a flag module under the hood, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And we also are capturing all this on view data and metadata. And then we're also linking CMS-only content back to this object. So this is what was previously a hodgepodge of Drupal 7 plus Strapi on those object pages. And now it's kind of centrally managed. So we just have one iteration of any piece of content, which makes, you know, auditing those things for accessibility or whatever it might be a little bit easier. And we have lots of links to searching and other metadata and also API data that was buried before, right? So like, you know, this is a pretty substantial iteration on how this page worked in the previous iteration. I'm going faster than I thought. Um, so to talk a little bit about enabling discovery and research, um, we had casual users and researchers that we needed to, provide a good interface for to explore the collections. I think that was a unique challenge here is, we're serving students, we're serving faculty, we're serving outside academics and scholars. We did fair number of small focus groups and conversations with curators and faculty to kind of get at what they wanted for discovering through the collections. We needed this to be consistent with the design system that we were working on. Had to be performant, had to be accessible. And this was all done primarily internally. The front end, some of the design aspects were so done with collaboration with our vendor. And so I think, this was also kind of a unique challenge here. Is building this really robust search experience for our collections within the confines of the Drupal site. So, um, again, we were focused on user experience, things that we didn't have that we wanted to have, suggestions, better suggestions. We really wanted to streamline some of our filters from our previous iteration. We wanted to kind of open up exploration of the data. So our really super users, researchers and things like that who are really wanting to get to specific data in specific fields and pull interesting sets of things could do that. And so where we landed, switch it back over here, is on a kind of two-part collection search. So we have our kind of our general search, and then we have an advanced search where you can search all these different fields under the hood in our collections data. But this whole application from within this white section of the website is a React application that's baked into the Drupal site. And so again, this was completely different, kind of its own project within a project to get this working. It's open search under the hood using our APIs to feed it. So again, the data across the CMS and the search are the same data under the hood. And we really leaned in hard. Jorge, our app developer, primarily did all of this work. And it was fun and challenging, especially this date component that I think we iterated on several times to kind of be able to filter to specific periods in our collection. Clearly have some interesting spikes there. We also added filters that previously never existed for things that were on display. So whether you could go see it at the museum, that was information that wasn't actively shared in the old museum. And now it is. Extended content is that kind of section of cards coming from the CMS. So we're feeding that data back into our search so that you can find data that has content. So if we clicked on any one of these, we would see some other piece of content along with it. And the other thing I'll say here is this was an interesting challenge because it's also this Drupal React hybrid thing going on. So we're managing the state of the user, right? Are you logged in? Are you not logged in? We still haven't ripped off that beta feature label, but basically if you sign in through the university, you can save objects. The saving of objects is done via the flag module. Even in the React application, we're still hitting flag module endpoints to save that data back. And we're passing some of the state between the Drupal application to the search interface. And this is not just on this page where the search interface comes. There's other places where search is embedded. Again, it's its own component that we can embed throughout the site in a few varieties, right? So we also have just a search bar that we can put on on pages and things like that. Just switching back here to our slides, if I can get there. So as I said, it's React plus Drupal, completely standalone application. We pulled in via private NPM package, which was a challenge to get that worked out. Again, Jorge, the app developer here, really worked hard to get that all working nicely. I think we kind of re-architected how the application got pulled in at least 2, if not 3 times, just with some growing pains. We're copying, some of the application code essentially to a custom Drupal module and then serving it through the site. That way, caching was a problem with this too. So, again, cache kind of ruling everything around us. Had some interesting hiccups, but those have largely been resolved. Just kind of to talk about yet another area where we had a lot of challenges is, we had media in a lot of different places. They had a lot of variety, multiple sources. We had duplication. Some things had transcripts. Some things didn't have transcripts. Some things had captions. Some things didn't have captions, right? Like all these challenges you have when you're dealing with content that's been born over a decade, right? And so trying to get things up to a better standard for accessibility compliance, just for general user compliance. Making the transcripts available for video and audio files, also really good for your search engines and your AI bots that will crawl our website. So interesting things to do there, right? Just also make it more findable. We can search it better. Lots of things to do. What we ended up doing is kind of simplifying this approach, right? We tried to find the minimum number of things we had to support that could meet the majority of our needs. All of our images sans a few things like SVGs at the moment, and maybe like 1 or 2 legacy images are served via something called the International Interoperability Image. Now I can't remember what the F stands for, framework. So IIIF, which is a kind of cultural institution museum born initiative to basically have a standard API across cultural institutions where you could share these URLs and the metadata underneath them so you can compare different works of art across multiple collections. So in this case, we could compare this Monet to Monets around the world and see the differences between them over time and things like that. So that's super interesting for the collections image part, but we also decided to leverage that for our website images because essentially we have something called serverless IIIF. Jorge, again, was able to spin up servers to kind of serve these files through like Lambda functions and all this other kind of stuff that, again, leaning on community supported projects and things like that, enabled us to basically have a CDN for image pipeline. And our partner, Blue Cadet, also had experience working with IIIF for some other museum clients. So they had some module code that was already written that we then, extracted upon and built upon. But again, it gives us the ability to crop it and scale it and change its color and rotate it and do different interesting things through that API for the images. So all of our images, for the most part, are being served through that system, depending a little bit on whether they're coming from our collections or they're more marketing our website images. And then our video and audio, we kind of simplified back down to one solution. So the reason why we ended up kind of across the internet and different services over the years was the one supported by the university wasn't really great at audio, was one of the big things. And so it got better. And so we were able to kind of re-ingest all that audio content back into the central system, which again is university maintained infrastructure and things like that. So now all of our AV comes from that central service. We have control over the player and things like that, so we can design it a little bit differently than the standard university, or if we really wanted to go make it bright pink or something, we could. So, flexibility there. And again, you know, there's some benefits to using a service for that, right? It does our transcriptions for us. Again, we have to go back and clean them up for, um, you know, AI is still not perfect, right? It's going to spell things wrong. It's going to misinterpret when people speak. So we've still gone in there and cleaning things up. But it's getting a lot better. And then we really wanted to make sure that um, we had like a good set of foundations, right, to build on, right? And that's what I meant by minimal exceptions, right? Like there's only a few things on the website that aren't served through these two systems. And it has to be basically like, we can't do it right now, but we'll probably do it at some point. So like I said, SVGs in the terms of like images, we're not serving through Drupal right now because I don't know that it would serve them well or be the right place for it. And we also had this challenge where, although it should be able to do it, we couldn't get it, our video platform, to serve ambient video for like background on the homepage and the visit page. So we ended up using Vimeo for that, just because we've used it on previous projects and things like that. It was a lot easier to set up and maintain. So again, minimal exceptions. Trying not to let it drift too much and get us back into a state of being scattered. So kind of to wrap up, I think the key kind of takeaways here are like, aim to build sites that are going to last long, like the foundations of the site. As you saw with the old Drupal 7 site, it went through several iterations and was able to grow and scale with the organization and was able to change with the times. Um, and I think, that core technology is going to continue to evolve, right? Like right now, we're looking at AI, we're looking at Drupal Canvas, we're looking at whatever other things are going to come out down the pike that we need to think about. How do we adapt to those things? I think open source is a really great place to be because it enables us to leverage the community. It enables us to contribute um, to whatever the future looks like, right? And I think there's a lot of momentum right now within the Drupal community, specifically around AI and things like that, and doing them responsibly. And it'll be really interesting to see kind of like what the future holds. But having that strong foundation, I hope it will enable us to kind of make the site last a long time. We have components that scale, right? The design, we're not really breaking the design. We haven't really built anything truly new since we launched. Um, it's really just been iterations, um, some tiny cleanup things here and there, bug fixes. No new major components we haven't hit just yet, but I'm sure we will at some point. And the fact that we have this architecture, I think will make that an easier transition. I think that building with components will make the eventual 5 to 10 year, hey, we want to redesign this ever so slightly way that most web projects go. Hopefully easier because we'll be able to test it a little bit more, see how different changes and I don't know, whatever is going to come down the pike in terms of what everybody thinks great design is on the web. Again, kind of having lived with the site for over a decade, you kind of saw the colorful come back again, different things come back, right? Like I think we see lots of trends, especially in like universities where we're not necessarily, pushing the envelope all that much in kind of radical design. And then, I think the other key thing here is just, having a clear vision of, how your data is going to flow in, how you're going to grow and scale that, how it's going to flex. And then most importantly, I think, working with vendors, with others internally, how do you actively collaborate to make a really good product? So like across design and development specifically, I think there was a lot of back and forth and conversation in this project to get it to where it needed to be. I know on the engineering side, there was a lot of work to get the data integration stuff just right, and it continues to be strong collaboration internally now to make sure that data is reliable. So I think really, it's really important to have everybody at the table working together on something massive in scale. And like I said, this was one of several digital things we were building simultaneously ahead of a building opening, right? So like very much a hard deadline that didn't move. And so I think again, it's really important to think about the long-term payoff of the investment up front of something that's foundational for web experiences. Here's a picture of the outside of the museum. If you're ever in the Princeton area, I hope you come visit. Have a lovely collection. There's generally around 4,000 objects on view, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have. John.
Sean, thanks very much for the presentation. And just a comment and a question, really. The comment being, uh, really appreciate the inclusion of accessibility information throughout the art museum website. I was looking around in there. It's not something people often take the time to do, particularly for things that are so visual. And so just real tip of the hat, because that's what I do here at Stanford. Question is, have you been has there been a push or pressure to move into like using Matterport or Concept 3D to do like virtual 3D tours of your museum spaces? And how have you tried to handle that with the model, the framework you got here?
Yeah, so we do have them. We had them on our old website. They're iframes. They're still iframes, I think, because I don't know that we have a web component for them, but I think that's the approach that we kind of set. Like one of the components we were strong advocates for with our vendor was, hey, we really need a thing that we can add stuff that we can't predict today what we're going to need, like what the new, like you said, if it's a 3D embed or an AR embed that we're going to need to support long term, or it's a gallery tour or something that's more interactive. So we did leverage, again, it's an iframe, or we were thinking long term web components, which I think is where it'll end up going. So yeah, I think we're positioned to do that on some of our exhibitions. You can see like the kind of walkthroughs and things like that that are Matterport now, which a third party makes. I think that I have concerns about accessibility with those platforms, especially like the AR, VR stuff. There's actually a lot of AR things going on inside the IIIF community. So like that interoperability framework. So there's things there. And again, because they're kind of cultural, government funded, and university based, they tend to think of accessibility a little bit more than maybe like some other groups. So generally, like controls are better, right? Like things like that. Yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but I hope it was helpful.
No, it did. Thanks very much.
Yep. Jim.
Yeah, those collection search filters in the UX, that was fantastic. But it's nagging me right now. You have a surprise me button, and I don't know what it does.
Okay, here I can show you what surprise me does. All right, so this is one of the things that came out from our user research is like we have so much stuff. Like right now, I don't know. Here, let's clear it. I think we're up to thinking reset. We have like 58,000 things that you can search right now out of 120,000 things that we have inside the collection. So like every day it's growing a little bit, right? So there's so much stuff. And we have some of these kind of like keywords for like casual users who don't know what they're looking for, who don't know how to explore, maybe aren't familiar with art, maybe they're students or things like that who don't have that exposure. So we can rotate these three. These are kind of like marketing controlled, right? Based around shows. Right now, it's still based around season. And the idea of the surprise me was like, hey, that's great that we can control some of these keywords, but I don't know, where's the moment of delight, right? And so the surprise me will randomly query an endpoint to get some term of things. I have a lot of things on cemeteries. Um, so just random things you might see, and then you can kind of go and explore kind of interesting things that you might find based on how they were tagged. I do think that this feature will grow over time, just in general tagging, right? Like I think uh, human curation of tags is a hard thing. It's always kind of been a hard thing. And we for sure have a lot of like people went through and they did the basic things. Like here's how many horses are on the website. That one's really well documented. But do we have every instance of a horse? Do we have every instance of elephants? No, because like it's just what people saw, and it's not necessarily the most meaningful tag. So I think it'll get better over time, but it's just a little place to kind of find something that you might not have found otherwise.
Any other questions? I think we're just about at time. About a minute. Well, thank you, Sean. That's awesome.
Thanks so
A
much.
lot of STC is do a lot of really cool things with it. It's very
For
helpful.
sure. Well, thanks so much for having me. Take care, everybody.